The waiting. Charlie Green stepped into the diner, his olive green army jacket buttoned up against the chill of the morning. It was an old jacket, fraying at the edges, but he wore it with quiet pride. It was a symbol of service and sacrifice, a piece of his past he wore on his back. His gaze drifted over the diner, noting the few patrons scattered around. An elderly couple sharing a plate of pancakes, a waitress with a worn-out smile, and a man in the corner, hiding behind a newspaper. Charlie found a small table near the window and sat down, his posture calm but vigilant. He was here to meet his son, Marcus, an officer with the city's police department. Despite their busy lives, they'd made a tradition of meeting for breakfast whenever Marcus could slip away from his duties. Today was one of those rare days, and Charlie was looking forward to catching up, to hearing his son's stories of the job, to laughing about shared memories. But as he settled into his seat, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. It was subtle at first, a sideways glance from the elderly couple, a quick, nervous look from the waitress as she approached. He'd felt it countless times before. The silent, unspoken question, "What's he doing here?" "Good morning, sir," the waitress greeted him, her tone polite but distant. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee, please." Charlie offered her a small, friendly smile, though he could sense her discomfort. She nodded, poured him a cup, and disappeared without another word. Charlie wrapped his hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He took a slow sip, savoring the bitterness, and glanced out the window at the quiet street. This part of town wasn't familiar to him, mostly upscale, mostly white, and rarely welcoming. But he hadn't let places like this bother him in years. He'd fought too many battles, both overseas and at home, to be intimidated by a few disapproving stares. The chime of the door drew his attention, and he turned just enough to see a tall, broad-shouldered man enter. The newcomer wore a police uniform, his face set in a perpetual scowl. His gaze swept the diner, pausing when it landed on Charlie. For a moment, Charlie thought nothing of it, just another officer, doing his rounds. But then the officer started walking toward him, each step deliberate, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. Charlie held his ground, his gaze steady as the officer stopped beside his table, casting a shadow over his coffee. "You lost, old man." The officer's voice was cold, edged with something that wasn't quite hostility, but certainly wasn't kindness. Charlie met his eyes calmly, keeping his tone even. "No, just waiting for my son." The officer's brows knitted together, his gaze flickering with a hint of disbelief. "Your son?" He glanced around the diner as if expecting to see a familiar face, then looked back at Charlie with an unmistakable smirk. "Funny. I don't see anyone like you around here often." Charlie knew what he meant, and he felt his jaw tighten, though he kept his composure. He'd faced men like this before, men who used authority like a weapon, who let prejudice cloud their judgment. But he wasn't about to let this officer goad him into a confrontation. "I'm just here for coffee," Charlie replied, his voice calm. "Nothing more." The officer scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "People around here get nervous when they see folks like you hanging around. You sure you're not causing trouble?" Charlie's fingers tightened around his mug, but he kept his gaze steady. "Just waiting for my son, officer. I'm not here to bother anyone." The officer leaned in, his face close enough that Charlie could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with something bitter. "Mind showing me some ID?" Charlie reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his veteran's ID, and held it out. The officer took it, barely glancing at it before tossing it back onto the table with a sneer. "A vet, huh? Not sure I buy it." Charlie took a slow breath, steadying himself. He'd been proud of his service, proud of what he'd given for his country, but there was no pride in having to prove himself to someone like this. "Believe it or don't," Charlie said quietly, "I know who I am." The officer let out a harsh laugh, loud enough to draw a few curious glances from other patrons. "Yeah, I know your type. Think you can just stroll in here like you belong." Charlie's patience was thinning, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not here to cause any problems, officer. Just a man having coffee." The officer's sneer deepened. "People like you always think you're entitled to something." Charlie's lips pressed together, his gaze hardening. He'd endured worse insults, but something about this man's arrogance, his blatant disrespect, grated on him. "I've earned the right to be here, same as anyone else." "Oh, you earned it, did you?" The officer leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "Well, maybe it's time you moved along before I make it official." Charlie felt a flash of anger, but he kept his tone steady. "I'm waiting for my son, and I'm not leaving." The officer's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he straightened up. "Suit yourself. Just know I'll be watching." The tension in the room was thick, the quiet murmur of patrons fading as more eyes turned toward the confrontation. Charlie forced himself to take another sip of coffee, trying to calm the simmering anger that threatened to bubble over. He'd been through too much, seen too much, to let a man like this get under his skin. But as he glanced at his watch, he wondered just how much longer his son would be. He didn't have to wait long. Just as the officer turned to walk away, the door chimed again, and Marcus stepped in, his tall, imposing figure cutting through the tension like a knife. He spotted his father immediately, a smile forming on his face, until he saw the officer standing over him, saw the hardened look in his father's eyes. Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a look of steely determination as he strode across the diner, his badge visible on his belt, his gaze fixed on the officer. The moment was electric, the air thick with anticipation as father and son locked eyes. The officer, oblivious to the connection, turned to Marcus with a smug grin. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. Marcus's gaze never wavered. "Yes, you can," he replied, his voice cold and unyielding. "That's my father you're talking to." The officer's smirk faltered, his eyes widening as the realization sank in. He glanced between Marcus and Charlie, his face paling as he processed the truth. This wasn't just some man sitting in the diner. This was the father of a respected officer. Charlie watched the shift in the officer's expression, a flicker of satisfaction warming him. He hadn't needed to fight, hadn't needed to raise his voice. His son was here, and that was enough. As the officer stammered, Marcus stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "I think you owe my father an apology." The officer's mouth opened, then closed, his face flushed with embarrassment and barely concealed rage. He looked at Charlie, his pride wounded, his authority undermined. Charlie met his gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. He didn't need an apology, didn't need this man's respect. He'd already won, simply by being here, by standing his ground, by showing that respect was something earned, not demanded. But as he watched the officer stammer, searching for words, Charlie couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity. For all the power this man thought he held, for all the control he thought he wielded, he was nothing without the respect of the people he served. And in that moment, Charlie knew he was the stronger man. As father and son stood together, the tension in the diner eased, the quiet murmur of voices returning as the officer finally backed away, his pride bruised, his authority shaken. And as Charlie looked at his son, he felt a quiet pride. A pride not just in what he'd accomplished, but in the man his son had become. A man who knew the true meaning of respect. A father's strength. Marcus clenched his fists, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior barely contained as he watched the officer retreat, his face a mix of embarrassment and frustration. The diner returned to its usual hum, though the patrons still stole quick glances at the two men in the corner, an older black man, calmly drinking his coffee, and his son, a respected police officer who had just subtly put one of his own in his place. "Are you all right, Dad?" Marcus asked quietly, pulling out a chair across from his father. Charlie looked up, his face softening as he saw the worry in his son's eyes. He gave a small nod, gesturing toward the seat. "Sit, son. Don't worry about me. Just another day." Marcus sighed as he took his seat, setting his cap on the table. He knew his father's resilience well. Charlie Green had always been a man who faced challenges head-on, a man who had endured and survived more than Marcus could ever fully understand. But knowing that didn't make it easier to see his father disrespected, especially not by someone who wore the same badge. "Dad," Marcus began, his voice low, "you shouldn't have to go through this. Not after everything you've done. You deserve respect." Charlie's face softened, and he reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his son's. "Son, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you live by, something you give even when it isn't returned. I don't let people like that officer shake me, because I know who I am. I know what I've done. And I know that no one can take that from me." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes searching his father's face. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, mixed with a familiar ache. He admired his father's strength, his unwavering calm in the face of prejudice and hostility. It was a strength Marcus tried to emulate every day, but he knew it came from a lifetime of experiences that he would never truly know. Charlie took another sip of his coffee, glancing around the diner. He noticed the nervous looks, the slight hush that fell over the tables near them. He was used to it, the subtle, almost invisible wall that seemed to separate him from others in places like this. But today, he wasn't alone. Today, his son was beside him, a reminder that times had changed, even if some people hadn't. "So," Charlie said, breaking the silence, "how's work treating you? Keeping you busy?" Marcus managed a small smile, grateful for his father's attempt to shift the conversation. "Busy enough," he replied. "You know how it is. Paperwork, late nights, a lot of calls. But it's good work. Feels like I'm making a difference." Charlie nodded approvingly. "That's what matters, son. Making a difference, helping people. That's why I wore that uniform all those years ago, too. To do something good, something that meant something." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each man lost in his thoughts. Marcus glanced at his father's hands, the fingers slightly bent and scarred, signs of a life lived with purpose and hardship. Those hands had carried him as a child, had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, had fought battles that Marcus could only imagine. And now, those hands held a simple cup of coffee, steady and unshaken, despite the earlier confrontation. "Dad," Marcus began again, his tone more serious, "I know you don't like to talk about it, but the war, what was it really like?" Charlie paused, his gaze drifting out the window, eyes lost in memories. "War changes you, son," he said quietly. "It's not just the battles, the noise, the fear. It's the little things, the things you carry with you long after it's over. The faces of the men beside you, the weight of knowing that not all of them made it back. You never forget that." Marcus listened intently, sensing the weight of his father's words. He knew Charlie rarely spoke of his time in the military, not because he was ashamed, but because some memories were simply too heavy to share. "I did things I'm proud of," Charlie continued, his voice steady. "And some things I wish I could forget. But I came back, and I had a family to live for. That's what kept me going. That's what still keeps me going." Marcus nodded, feeling the surge of emotion. He'd heard fragments of his father's story over the years, but this was different. There was a depth in Charlie's voice, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. It reminded Marcus of the sacrifices his father had made, of the quiet strength that had shaped him into the man he was today. "Thank you, Dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For what you did back then, and for what you've done for me." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes searching his father's face. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride, mixed with a familiar ache. He admired his father's strength, his unwavering calm in the face of prejudice and hostility. It was a strength Marcus tried to emulate every day, but he knew it came from a lifetime of experiences that he would never truly know. Charlie took another sip of his coffee, glancing around the diner. He noticed the nervous looks, the slight hush that fell over the tables near them. He was used to it, the subtle, almost invisible wall that seemed to separate him from others in places like this. But today, he wasn't alone. Today, his son was beside him, a reminder that times had changed, even if some people hadn't. "So," Charlie said, breaking the silence, "how's work treating you? Keeping you busy?" Marcus managed a small smile, grateful for his father's attempt to shift the conversation. "Busy enough," he replied. "You know how it is. Paperwork, late nights, a lot of calls. But it's good work. Feels like I'm making a difference." Charlie nodded approvingly. "That's what matters, son. Making a difference, helping people. That's why I wore that uniform all those years ago, too. To do something good, something that meant something." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each man lost in his thoughts. Marcus glanced at his father's hands, the fingers slightly bent and scarred, signs of a life lived with purpose and hardship. Those hands had carried him as a child, had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, had fought battles that Marcus could only imagine. And now, those hands held a simple cup of coffee, steady and unshaken, despite the earlier confrontation. "Dad," Marcus began again, his tone more serious, "I know you don't like to talk about it, but the war, what was it really like?" Charlie paused, his gaze drifting out the window, eyes lost in memories. "War changes you, son," he said quietly. "It's not just the battles, the noise, the fear. It's the little things, the things you carry with you long after it's over. The faces of the men beside you, the weight of knowing that not all of them made it back. You never forget that." Marcus listened intently, sensing the weight of his father's words. He knew Charlie rarely spoke of his time in the military, not because he was ashamed, but because some memories were simply too heavy to share. "I did things I'm proud of," Charlie continued, his voice steady, "and some things I wish I could forget. But I came back, and I had a family to live for. That's what kept me going. That's what still keeps me going." Marcus nodded, feeling the surge of emotion. He'd heard fragments of his father's story over the years, but this was different. There was a depth in Charlie's voice, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. It reminded Marcus of the sacrifices his father had made, of the quiet strength that had shaped him into the man he was today. "Thank you, Dad," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For what you did back then, and for what you've done for me." Charlie looked at his son, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Marcus. I did what any father would do. I did it because I love you." The two men shared a moment of silence, the air between them filled with unspoken words, with years of love and respect. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to honor his father's legacy, to live by the values Charlie had instilled in him. But their moment was interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the counter. The officer from earlier, clearly still fuming, was speaking heatedly with the waitress, his frustration evident. Marcus felt his chest tighten, anger flaring up once more. He wanted to protect his father, to shield him from this man's disrespect, but he knew that Charlie didn't need protecting. Charlie had faced worse. Charlie had survived. The officer turned, his gaze settling once again on Charlie and Marcus. He straightened his posture, as if trying to reclaim his authority, his eyes narrowing as he approached their table once more. "Thought you'd be gone by now," he muttered, his tone laced with contempt. "Didn't expect to see you lingering around, making everyone uncomfortable." Marcus stood up slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "Officer," he said evenly, "I think you've done enough. My father and I are here to enjoy a meal, just like anyone else. I suggest you leave us to it." The officer's face twisted, a sneer forming as he took a step closer to Marcus, ignoring the badge on his belt. "This isn't your business, son," he growled. "Just because you wear that uniform doesn't mean you get to tell me what to do." Charlie placed a hand on Marcus's arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. He looked up at the officer, his voice firm but steady. "My son is right. We're here for breakfast, nothing more. We don't want any trouble." The officer's gaze flickered with irritation, his fists clenching at his sides. "People like you," he spat, his voice barely a whisper. "Always thinking you can just walk in, demand respect." Charlie's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Respect is given when it's deserved," he replied quietly. "And it's clear you don't understand that." The officer's face flushed, his anger boiling over. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Charlie by the collar, pulling him up from his chair. The diner fell silent, patrons watching in stunned horror as the officer's grip tightened, his face twisted with rage. "Enough." Marcus's voice rang out, cold and commanding, his hand on his holster as he stepped between his father and the officer. "Release him. Now." The officer's eyes darted to Marcus's hand, his bravado faltering for a moment. He released Charlie, pushing him back into his chair with a sneer. "This isn't over," he muttered, glaring at both men before storming out of the diner. Charlie straightened his collar, his expression calm despite the encounter. He looked at Marcus, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You handled that well, son," he said softly. Marcus shook his head, a mixture of anger and frustration in his gaze. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Dad. I should have stopped him sooner." Charlie placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You did what you could. Sometimes, standing your ground is all you can do." They sat in silence once more, the tension slowly dissipating as the diner resumed its quiet murmur. But the memory of the confrontation lingered, a reminder of the challenges Charlie continued to face, even after all he'd given for his country. As they finished their coffee, Marcus made a silent vow. He would use his position, his voice, to make a difference, to ensure that men like his father would never have to endure such treatment again. It was a small step, but it was a start, a way to honor the legacy of a man who had taught him the true meaning of strength and respect. The ripple effect. The tension of the diner incident stayed with Marcus, shadowing him like a persistent fog, even after he left his father that day. He couldn't shake the image of his father, sitting quietly and dignified, enduring the taunts and mistreatment without ever losing his composure. And that officer, the way he wielded his badge like a weapon, as if the uniform somehow excused his cruelty. The experience was a bitter reminder that the struggles his father faced hadn't ended with his military service, nor had they ended with Marcus's position in the police force. In many ways, they had only evolved. Marcus returned to his precinct later that day, his mind still replaying the incident, each moment another sting to his conscience. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed several of his colleagues, some nodding in acknowledgement, others casting curious glances his way. News of the diner incident had spread quickly, as rumors often did in the precinct. The encounter had stirred something within the department, a current of tension that Marcus could sense in the way his peers avoided eye contact, the hushed conversations that trailed off when he approached. At his desk, Marcus's partner, Officer Kim Alvarez, sat waiting for him, her brow furrowed as she sifted through paperwork. Kim was one of the few people in the department Marcus trusted completely. She was sharp, principled, and didn't shy away from speaking her mind. As he approached, she looked up, her expression softening. "Heard what happened," she said quietly, keeping her voice low. "You all right?" Marcus nodded, taking the seat beside her. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's my father I'm worried about." Kim leaned forward, folding her hands together. "From what I know of your dad, he's not easily shaken." "He's not," Marcus agreed, his voice heavy with respect. "But it doesn't mean he should have to put up with that kind of treatment, especially from someone in uniform." Kim's gaze turned steely. "Stark, right? I heard it was him." Marcus's jaw clenched at the mention of the officer's name. Officer Brent Stark. He'd only been in the precinct a few years, but he had a reputation that left a bad taste in the mouths of those who valued integrity. Stark was known for his arrogance, his tendency to push his weight around, especially in neighborhoods where he thought he could get away with it. Complaints had surfaced here and there, whispers of excessive force, racial bias, and misconduct, but none had ever reached the level of an official reprimand. Until now. "Yeah, it was him," Marcus replied, the anger simmering beneath his calm tone. "He treated my father like he was nothing, like he had no right to be there." Kim sighed, shaking her head. "He's been like that with others too. People are afraid to speak up, but we've all seen it." Marcus looked at her, a question forming in his mind. "Do you think he's untouchable?" Kim hesitated, glancing around the room before lowering her voice. "He thinks he is. And as long as no one stands up to him, he kind of is. But you could do something about it." A flicker of hope sparked within Marcus. He was no stranger to the complexities of police culture, the silent codes of loyalty, and unspoken rules that governed life within the precinct. Challenging a fellow officer, especially on grounds of misconduct, was a serious decision, one that could earn him respect or make him a target. He thought of his father, the quiet strength in his eyes as he faced Stark's disrespect, the resilience he'd carried throughout his life. If anyone deserved justice, it was Charlie Green. Marcus felt a responsibility not just as a son, but as an officer, to ensure that men like Stark were held accountable. "I don't want to ignore this, Kim," he said finally. "If we let him get away with this, what message does that send to the community? Or to officers who actually want to protect and serve?" Kim nodded, her eyes reflecting his resolve. "You're right. But it won't be easy. You know how these things can get swept under the rug, especially when it's one of our own." Marcus took a deep breath, his determination solidifying. "Then I'll make sure it's impossible to sweep under the rug. If he wants to abuse his authority, he'll have to answer for it." They spent the next few hours gathering records, scanning through Stark's file, documenting incidents where his behavior had raised red flags. Though many of the reports were sparse on details, there was a troubling pattern: complaints from residents, notes from other officers who had witnessed questionable actions, even a few reprimands that had mysteriously never turned into formal disciplinary actions. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Stark's actions had gone unchecked for far too long. But bringing the evidence forward wasn't enough. They needed someone willing to testify, someone who would speak openly about Stark's behavior without fear of retribution. And that was no small task. "Marcus," Kim said, her tone thoughtful as she looked over the records, "what about your dad?" He blinked, caught off guard. "My dad? You want him to testify?" Kim nodded. "Think about it. Your father's a veteran, a man with honor and integrity. People respect him. And if he's willing to come forward, his word would carry weight." Marcus hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew his father wouldn't back down from speaking the truth, but he also didn't want to expose Charlie to more conflict. Yet, at the same time, he knew his father's strength came from a lifetime of standing up for what was right. "I'll talk to him," Marcus said finally, a mix of apprehension and hope in his voice. "If he's willing, this could be the push we need." That evening, Marcus drove to his father's modest home, a small single-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. He'd grown up here, in this house filled with memories of laughter and lessons, a place where his father's values had shaped him into the man he was today. Charlie answered the door, his face breaking into a warm smile as he saw his son. "Back again so soon?" Marcus chuckled, stepping inside and giving his father a hug. "Yeah, I figured you could use some company after this morning." They settled in the living room, a comfortable silence stretching between them as Marcus tried to find the right words. Finally, he looked at his father, his expression serious. "Dad, I need to talk to you about what happened today." Charlie's smile faded, his eyes growing thoughtful. "That officer, Stark, right?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah. It's not the first time he's treated people like that. He's got a history, Dad. A pattern of abusing his authority, especially with people who don't fit his idea of who belongs." Charlie listened, his gaze steady as he absorbed his son's words. "And you're thinking of doing something about it?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "I want to file a formal complaint. But it's going to take more than just paperwork. We need someone who's willing to come forward, to speak about what happened. I know it's asking a lot, but would you consider testifying?" Charlie looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of his armchair. His face was thoughtful. And for a moment, Marcus feared he might refuse. He didn't want to pressure his father into something that would bring him more trouble, but he also knew that this was the best chance they had to hold Stark accountable. After a long silence, Charlie looked up, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "If it means stopping that man from treating others the way he treated me, then yes, I'll do it." Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride, his respect for his father deepening. "Thank you, Dad. I know it's not easy." Charlie shook his head, a small smile forming on his lips. "I've been through worse, son, and if standing up to him means something good comes out of this, then I'll do it. I've never backed down from a fight when it mattered." They spent the rest of the evening discussing the steps they would take, outlining everything Charlie could recall about the incident. Marcus listened intently, making notes, formulating a plan to ensure that their case would be solid and undeniable. He knew that this would be an uphill battle. Police culture didn't often embrace self-examination, especially when it came to exposing one of its own. But as he sat with his father that night, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. This was about the integrity of the badge he wore, the values he had sworn to uphold. And it was about honoring the sacrifices his father had made, the battles he had fought, and the respect he deserved. As he left his father's house that night, Marcus felt a quiet determination settle within him. He knew there would be consequences, pushback from colleagues, possibly even threats to his career. But he also knew that some things were worth fighting for, that justice wasn't always easy or convenient. In the days that followed, Marcus prepared the case, gathering evidence, statements, and documentation. And as he did, he could feel the ripple effect spreading, a subtle shift within the precinct as whispers of the investigation began to circulate. Some officers offered him quiet support, while others looked at him with suspicion, their loyalty to the thin blue line unshaken. But for Marcus, there was no turning back. He was ready to stand with his father, to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because this wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for dignity, for respect, and for the promise that men like his father would never again have to endure the indignity of prejudice within the very country they had served. The stand. The next few days in the precinct were nothing short of tense. News of the formal complaint against Officer Stark had circulated faster than Marcus expected, and it wasn't long before the entire department knew that one of their own was facing allegations of misconduct. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgments hanging in the air. Conversations seemed to hush when he entered a room, and he noticed the subtle, defensive glances exchanged among officers who didn't quite know where to place their loyalty. Marcus's partner, Kim, remained steadfast by his side, her resolve unwavering. She'd always been one to follow her own moral compass, and seeing Marcus take a stand only strengthened her support for him. Yet even she could feel the strain of the decision, the way it isolated them from the larger body of the precinct. It was an uncomfortable position, and Marcus was aware that for many, standing against Stark felt like a betrayal of the unwritten rule to protect their own. One morning, Marcus found a note slipped into his locker. The paper was crumpled, the handwriting hurried, as if the person had written it in haste or anger. "You think you're doing something noble, but all you're doing is tearing this department apart. Remember, loyalty matters." Marcus read the note, a hollow ache forming in his chest. He'd known that filing a complaint would make waves, but he hadn't anticipated the level of animosity it would provoke. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, taking a moment to breathe. He reminded himself why he was doing this: for his father, for the community, and for the integrity of the badge he wore. But the challenges didn't stop at notes. Stark had friends in high places, and it wasn't long before Marcus found himself called into his captain's office. Captain Blake was a grizzled man in his late 50s, with a face worn by years on the job, and a gaze as sharp as a hawk's. He'd always had a reputation for fairness, but he was also known to fiercely defend his officers when he believed they were under attack. "Marcus," Captain Blake began, gesturing for him to sit. "I've heard about the complaint you filed against Officer Stark. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Marcus nodded, his face resolute. "Yes, sir. I do." Blake leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "Stark's been with us for years. He's rough around the edges, sure, but he's also put in a lot of time on the force. A complaint like this could end his career." Marcus held the captain's gaze. "With all due respect, Captain, he's a danger to the community. He abused his authority, disrespected my father, and I have reason to believe he's treated others the same way. I can't ignore that." The captain's expression tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Marcus, I get it. I really do. Your father's a good man. I met him years ago at one of the veterans' events. I know what he's done for this country, and I respect him. But there are dynamics at play here that go beyond just one incident." Marcus felt his jaw clench, a simmering anger beginning to rise. "What are you saying, Captain? That Stark's record, his years of service, somehow excuse what he's done?" Blake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying you need to think carefully about what this will mean for you, for your career, for the relationships you've built here. There's a certain loyalty we expect from our own." Marcus's voice was firm, unyielding. "Respect isn't about loyalty, sir. It's about accountability. If we ignore behavior like Stark's, we're saying it's okay. And it's not. Not for him, not for anyone." Blake sat back, his gaze unreadable as he studied Marcus. After a long silence, he finally nodded, though his expression remained tense. "All right, Officer Green. If you're committed to this, I won't stand in your way. But know this, there will be consequences. This department doesn't take kindly to internal conflicts. You may find yourself without the support you're used to." Marcus's heart pounded, but he met the captain's gaze with unwavering resolve. "I understand, Captain, but I'm prepared to stand by this." With a curt nod, Blake dismissed him, his expression unreadable as Marcus left the office. The door clicked shut behind him, and Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He'd taken a stand, but he knew that from this point on, he was walking a path that could lead to isolation, or worse. Back at his desk, Marcus and Kim resumed their work in silence. She shot him a supportive look, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "I heard," she murmured, glancing around the room. "It's not easy, but you're doing the right thing." Marcus nodded, though he could feel the weight pressing down on him. "I know, but it's harder than I thought." Over the next few days, the investigation began in earnest. Witnesses were interviewed, and Marcus's father, Charlie, was brought in to recount his experience. Despite the lingering tension, Charlie remained calm and composed, answering questions with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Marcus watched his father, admiring the strength and resilience he displayed even in the face of scrutiny. As Charlie described the incident, detailing the officer's words and actions, Marcus could see the shock and discomfort on the faces of those in the room. The truth was undeniable, and the impact of his father's testimony reverberated through the precinct. After the interview, as they left the precinct together, Marcus turned to his father, his heart heavy with gratitude and pride. "Dad, thank you. I know this isn't easy for you." Charlie placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Son, standing up for what's right is never easy, but it's necessary. I didn't fight all those years for freedom and justice just to sit back and let men like that officer tear it down." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Dad. More than I can say." Charlie gave him a small, warm smile. "And I'm proud of you, Marcus. You're doing something that not everyone has the courage to do. Just remember that." In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the complaint continued to spread. Some officers approached Marcus with quiet words of support, subtle nods of approval, while others avoided him altogether, their silence a clear indication of their disapproval. Marcus knew he'd chosen a difficult path, but he clung to the words his father had spoken. Standing up for what was right was necessary, even if it meant standing alone. The climax came one afternoon when Marcus encountered Stark in the locker room. Stark was packing up his things, his expression dark and unreadable. As Marcus approached, Stark looked up, his eyes narrowing with barely contained fury. "So, you really went through with it," Stark muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. Marcus met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I did what I had to do. Stark, you crossed a line, and you know it." Stark's face twisted in anger. "You think you're some kind of hero. You think ratting out a fellow officer makes you better than me." "This isn't about being better," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "It's about accountability, about respect for the badge we wear. You forgot what that badge stands for, and it's my duty to remind you." Stark let out a harsh laugh, his voice laced with bitterness. "Respect? You think you deserve respect? You're a traitor, Green. Turning your back on your own for some washed-up vet who doesn't know his place." Marcus's fists clenched, but he kept his cool. "That washed-up vet is my father, a man who sacrificed more than you could ever understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he, and everyone else, gets the respect they deserve." Stark sneered, his face red with anger. "You're making a mistake, Green. You think you can just tear down everything I've built. You'll regret this." Marcus stepped closer, his voice a quiet but firm warning. "The only mistake here is you thinking that you can get away with treating people like they're less than human. Those days are over, Stark." For a moment, Stark seemed ready to lash out, his hands clenched into fists, his body tense. But instead, he turned away, muttering under his breath as he stormed out of the locker room. Marcus watched him go, a strange mix of relief and resolve settling in his chest. He knew he'd just made a powerful enemy, but he also knew that he was standing on the right side of history. As the door swung shut behind Stark, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one complaint, one incident. It was about changing the culture, about standing up for the principles he and his father had always believed in. And as he left the precinct that day, Marcus knew that, no matter what happened, he would continue this fight, for his father, for his community, and for the values that made him who he was. Because respect, he realized, wasn't just something given. It was something earned through action, through courage, and through the unwavering belief that justice was worth any cost. A ripple becomes a wave. As the investigation deepened, Marcus could feel the walls closing in. Every day at the precinct felt like a silent battle, with lines drawn and loyalties tested. Those who had once been his friends now watched him with wary eyes, and the weight of his actions seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Yet, Marcus remained steadfast, bolstered by his father's quiet strength and the knowledge that he was doing what was right. Meanwhile, whispers of the complaint had spread beyond the precinct, leaking into the community. The local news stations caught wind of the story, and soon there were murmurs about a police officer challenging systemic abuse within his own department. It wasn't long before reporters began calling the precinct, sniffing around for details. The story of a black veteran disrespected and mistreated by an officer, and his son's unwavering resolve to stand up for him, was a narrative that resonated with people. Marcus knew that this exposure would draw both support and backlash, but he was ready. His father had always taught him to stand by his principles, even when it was uncomfortable. And he could feel his father's pride in every word of encouragement, in every small smile that told him he was doing the right thing. Charlie had been through worse, Marcus reminded himself, and so could he. One evening, As Marcus prepared to leave the precinct, he found his captain, Blake, waiting for him near the exit. The captain's face was unreadable, his usual stern demeanor softened by something that Marcus couldn't quite place. "Walk with me," Blake said, nodding toward the door. Marcus followed him outside, the cool night air filling his lungs as they strolled down the sidewalk in silence. They walked a few blocks, the quiet punctuated by the distant hum of traffic, until Blake finally spoke. "You know, Marcus," he began, his voice low, "I've been doing this job a long time. Seen a lot of things I wish I hadn't. Lost some good men along the way." He paused, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But I've also seen men who were willing to fight for something they believed in, even when it meant standing alone. Those men are rare in this line of work." Marcus glanced at his captain, surprised by the tone of respect in his voice. "Thank you, sir, but it isn't easy. I'm losing friends. People I thought I could trust don't even look me in the eye anymore." Blake nodded, his face hardening. "That's the thing about change, Marcus. It's uncomfortable. People like the status quo because it's familiar, even when it's flawed. But what you're doing is different. And it's making them question things they'd rather ignore." They walked in silence for a few more steps before Blake stopped, turning to face Marcus. "I need you to understand something, though. This fight you're in, it's going to cost you. People will push back. They'll test you, try to break you, because what you're doing threatens their sense of order." Marcus met Blake's gaze, feeling the weight of his words. "I'm prepared for that, Captain. I knew this wouldn't be easy." Blake's eyes softened, a flicker of admiration breaking through his usually stoic expression. "I'm proud of you, Marcus, and I hope you know that not everyone in this department sees you as a traitor. Some of us are watching, quietly hoping that you succeed. We need men like you to remind us of what we're supposed to stand for." With a firm handshake, Blake turned and walked back toward the precinct, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. As he watched his captain disappear into the night, Marcus felt a surge of hope, a small but potent reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this battle. The following day, Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing case files when he received an unexpected call. It was from a local community leader, Reverend Isaac Williams, who had heard about the case through the news. Reverend Williams was a well-respected figure in the community, known for his work in advocating for civil rights and justice. He was a man whose presence commanded attention, and Marcus felt a sense of honor and apprehension at receiving his call. "Officer Green," the Reverend's deep, steady voice filled the line. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you're doing. I know it's not easy, but your actions have inspired many of us. You're standing up for principles that have been overlooked for too long." Marcus felt a wave of gratitude and humility. "Thank you, Reverend Williams. It means a lot to hear that. Honestly, this has been harder than I expected, but I'm just trying to do what's right." "Doing what's right often comes at a cost," Reverend Williams replied. "But you're not alone. The community sees you, and we support you. In fact, we're organizing a gathering in solidarity with you and your father. I think it's time people see the faces of those who stand for justice." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected this kind of response. "A gathering? I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll be there, son," the Reverend said warmly. "Your presence will mean more than you realize. Let people see the man behind the badge, a man willing to stand up for his father, for what's right." Marcus agreed, feeling a sense of responsibility settle over him. The Reverend's words echoed in his mind as he prepared himself for the gathering. This was no longer just a personal fight for his father's dignity. It was a battle that resonated with people who had faced similar injustices, who saw in Marcus a glimmer of hope for change. On the day of the gathering, Marcus arrived at the community center with his father by his side. Charlie had been hesitant at first, not wanting to draw attention to himself, but Marcus had assured him that his presence would mean a lot to everyone there. As they walked through the doors, they were greeted by a crowd of people, community members, local activists, and even a few familiar faces from Marcus's childhood. Reverend Williams was there, standing at the front, his hands folded together as he greeted them with a warm smile. The room was filled with a quiet energy, a collective determination that reminded Marcus of the marches he'd seen in history books, the powerful movements that had shaped their nation. As they took their places at the front, Reverend Williams addressed the crowd, his voice strong and steady. "We're here today to stand with a father and his son, two men who have shown us the courage it takes to demand respect, to fight for dignity, and to challenge a system that has too often turned a blind eye to injustice." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a swell of emotion as he looked at his father, who stood with his back straight, his face calm but proud. For Charlie, this wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about integrity, about standing up for what he believed in, just as he had done during his years in the military. Reverend Williams gestured for Marcus to step forward, handing him the microphone. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the eyes of the community upon him. "I'm not here as a hero," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm just a man, a son who loves his father, who believes in the values that he taught me. My father served this country, sacrificed for it, and he deserves the same respect as any other man. When I saw him treated with disrespect by someone who wore the same badge I do, I knew I couldn't stay silent." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This isn't just about one incident," Marcus continued. "It's about the countless people who face similar experiences, who've been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're less than others. We wear this badge to protect and serve everyone, not just those who look or act a certain way. My father taught me that respect is something you live by, something you earn through your actions." He glanced at his father, who nodded in encouragement. "I know this journey won't be easy. I've faced backlash, lost friends, and I know there will be more obstacles ahead. But I also know that I'm not alone. Standing here today, I see people who believe in change, who believe that justice is worth fighting for. And I promise you, I won't stop until that change becomes a reality." The crowd erupted in applause, people rising to their feet, some cheering, others wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus felt a rush of relief and pride, the weight of his decision lightening as he realized the impact he was having, not just on his father, but on an entire community. After the gathering, people came forward to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their own stories of encounters with prejudice and injustice. Each story added to his resolve, strengthening his commitment to see this through, no matter the cost. As the crowd began to thin, Marcus and his father found a quiet corner, sharing a moment of reflection. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," Charlie said softly, his eyes shining with pride. "You've done something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. You've given people hope." Marcus looked at his father, a surge of emotion swelling in his chest. "I learned it from you, Dad. Everything I am, everything I believe, it's because of you." They embraced, father and son, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. Marcus knew that there were battles yet to come, that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he also knew that he was no longer fighting alone. This was a movement now, a ripple that had become a wave, fueled by the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. And as he walked away from the community center that night, hand in hand with his father, Marcus felt a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one officer, one complaint, or even one act of disrespect. This was about justice, and he was ready to see it through, no matter where the path would lead. A new legacy. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change, both inside and outside the precinct. The community support for Marcus and his father, Charlie, had sparked something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a single stand against one officer's abuse of power had evolved into a full-fledged movement calling for accountability, respect, and reform within the police department. Marcus had become the face of that movement, a reluctant hero for those who had long been denied justice. The precinct was a different place now. The once quiet, unspoken tension had transformed into open discussions, debates, and at times, Heated confrontations. Officers were forced to confront their own biases, their own complicity in a culture that had allowed men like Stark to operate unchecked. Some welcomed the change, seeing it as an opportunity to rebuild trust with the community they served. Others resented it, viewing Marcus as a traitor who had disrupted the brotherhood. One morning, Marcus was called into Captain Blake's office once again. The captain's face was grave as he motioned for Marcus to sit. Marcus took a seat, his stomach twisting with anticipation. By now, he had learned to expect the unexpected. Blake leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Marcus, I wanted you to hear this from me first. Stark has been officially terminated." The review board went through the evidence, and it was unanimous. "He's out." Marcus felt a wave of relief, tempered by a quiet sense of victory. This was the outcome he'd fought for, yet he knew it was only one step in a much larger journey. Still, the knowledge that Stark would no longer be able to wear the badge was a powerful validation, not just for Marcus, but for his father and everyone who had suffered under Stark's abuse. "Thank you, Captain," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I appreciate you keeping me in the loop." Blake's expression softened, and he nodded. "You did good, Marcus. Better than good. You set a precedent, and you showed this department what real integrity looks like. Not everyone may appreciate it now, but you've given us all a chance to reflect on what this badge really means." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling between them. Finally, Blake cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "There's more," he continued. "In light of everything that's happened, the department has decided to implement a new training program focused on community relations, respect, and accountability. We're working with community leaders, including Reverend Williams, to build something that will foster better relationships with the people we serve. And we want you to help lead it." Marcus's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? You want me to lead the program?" Blake nodded, his expression earnest. "You've earned the respect of this community, Marcus, and you've proven that you're not afraid to speak up, even when it's difficult. That's the kind of leadership we need right now. This isn't just about teaching new recruits. It's about changing the culture from within. We need someone who understands both sides of this issue, someone who can bridge the gap." Marcus felt a surge of pride and responsibility. This was more than he'd ever expected, more than he'd thought possible. The chance to shape the future of the department, to ensure that respect and accountability became cornerstones of the training process. It was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. "I'd be honored, Captain," Marcus replied, his voice filled with determination. "I'll do everything I can to make this work." Blake extended his hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. As he left the captain's office, a sense of purpose filled him. This was more than a victory. It was a new beginning, a chance to build a legacy that would honor his father's sacrifices and pave the way for future generations of officers to serve with integrity. The launch of the new training program brought Marcus into close collaboration with community leaders, civil rights advocates, and members of the precinct who shared his vision. Together, they created a curriculum that emphasized empathy, accountability, and respect. Role-playing exercises allowed recruits to experience situations from the perspectives of the people they served, fostering understanding and compassion. The training also included sessions on bias recognition and de-escalation tactics, teaching officers to respond to conflict with calmness and restraint. Marcus threw himself into the work, determined to create something meaningful, something that would outlast him. He spent hours meeting with community members, listening to their stories, understanding their fears and hopes. Each story reminded him of why he had started this journey, why he had stood up to Stark, and challenged the status quo. This was about more than just one officer's behavior. It was about creating a department that truly served its community. One evening, after a particularly long day of training sessions, Marcus received a message from Reverend Williams inviting him to speak at a community event. The Reverend wanted him to share his journey, to inspire others with the story of how one man's stand could create lasting change. Marcus agreed, though he felt a twinge of nervousness. He was still getting used to the idea of being a public figure, of having his actions scrutinized and discussed by people he didn't even know. The night of the event, Marcus arrived at the community center with his father. Charlie was his usual quiet, steady self, offering his son a reassuring smile as they entered the packed hall. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: families, veterans, activists, students. They had all come to hear Marcus speak, to see the man who had challenged an institution and won. As Marcus stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts as he looked out at the sea of faces, each one a reminder of the community he had vowed to serve. "I'm here today because of my father," Marcus began, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "Because he taught me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. My father served this country with honor, and he faced challenges that I can barely imagine. But through it all, he never lost his integrity, his respect for others, or his commitment to justice." He glanced at Charlie, who nodded in quiet support, his eyes shining with pride. "When I saw my father disrespected by someone who wore the same badge I do, I knew I couldn't stay silent," Marcus continued. "I knew that if I wanted to honor everything he taught me, I had to stand up. Not just for him, but for everyone who has been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're less than others." The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of admiration and empathy. "I know that change isn't easy," Marcus went on. "It's uncomfortable, and it challenges us to look at things we'd rather ignore. But real change, the kind that lasts, starts with accountability. It starts with each of us taking a hard look at ourselves and asking if we're living up to the values we claim to represent." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, I'm proud to say that our department is making strides. We're implementing new training programs, working with community leaders, and striving to rebuild the trust that has been broken. This is just the beginning, but I believe we're on the right path." The room erupted in applause, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Marcus felt a swell of emotion, a deep sense of fulfillment that he hadn't expected. This was his father's legacy, his own legacy, a legacy of courage, integrity, and the unwavering belief in the power of justice. As the applause died down, Marcus noticed several young men and women in the audience, their faces filled with admiration and hope. He realized that they were looking to him as a role model, as someone who had shown them that change was possible, that they too could make a difference. After the event, people came up to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how his story had inspired them. Some were parents who wanted a better world for their children. Others were young people who saw in Marcus a figure they could look up to. Each interaction filled Marcus with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to continue the work he had started. Later that night, as he and Charlie walked home together, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done good, son," Charlie said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Better than I ever imagined. You're making a difference, one that will last long after we're gone." Marcus looked at his father, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Dad. You taught me everything I know about honor and respect. This isn't just my victory. It's ours." Charlie smiled, his eyes shining with unjust tears. "I'm proud to see the man you've become, Marcus. And I know your mother would be too." They walked in silence for a while, the night air cool and calm around them. Marcus felt a sense of peace, a feeling of completeness that he hadn't known he needed. This journey had been long and difficult, filled with challenges he hadn't anticipated. But he had emerged stronger, with a new sense of purpose and a legacy he was proud to carry forward. As they reached Charlie's doorstep, Marcus turned to his father, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for teaching me to stand up, even when it's hard." Charlie placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You've done me proud, Marcus, and you'll keep doing it, long after I'm gone. Just remember, you're not just wearing that badge. You're carrying a legacy, They embraced father and son, two men bound by love, respect, and a shared belief in justice. And as Marcus walked away that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to continue the work he had started, knowing that he was not alone. He was part of something larger, a legacy of courage, honor, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. And as long as he had breath, he would fight to make sure that legacy endured.